An 11-year-old girl vanished in broad daylight, just a few dozen meters from her home. Authorities launched one of the largest missing child searches in Northern California history. Thousands of leads were investigated. Helicopters and police dogs were deployed, yet for 18 years, she seemed to have vanished without a trace. The most shocking part? Her kidnapper was a registered sex offender whose home was visited by police and parole officers more than 60 times. Not once did anyone discover the missing girl living behind the property. How could authorities visit a kidnapper's home more than 60 times and never find his victim? J.C. Lee Dugard was born on the 3rd of May, 1980, in Los Angeles. She was the firstborn daughter of Terry Probin. J.C.'s biological father was Ken Slayton, but their relationship was brief. Sometime later, Terry married Carl Probin. They had a daughter together named Shayna. In 1990, the whole family moved from Los Angeles to the small, peaceful town of Myers in California, not far from South Lake Tahoe. For J.C., this was her true home. When the incident occurred in 1991, J.C. had just turned 11 years old. She was a rather quiet, somewhat shy, and insecure girl. J.C. was especially close to her mother. Every morning, she always looked forward to her mother's hug and kiss before heading to school. J.C. lived a normal life, like any other young girl, going to school, playing with friends. She often felt that her stepfather, Carl, loved her younger sister, Shayna, more than her, so she always tried her best not to upset him. On the morning of the 10th of June, 1991, just 2 days before her class trip to a water park, one year, old J.C. Lee Dugard left home for the school bus stop. She wore her favorite t-shirt and a silver butterfly ring her mother had given her years earlier. As she walked, she thought excitedly about the upcoming trip. Suddenly, a strange car began following her. Before J.C. could react, the vehicle stopped beside her. The man inside rolled down the window, pulled out a stun gun, and fired. J.C. collapsed to the ground, dazed and terrified. She tried to crawl toward nearby bushes, but the attacker shocked her again, grabbed her, and dragged her into the car. A blanket was thrown over her as the vehicle sped away. Only then did J.C. realize the man was not acting alone. A woman was also involved in the abduction. The entire kidnapping lasted less than 30 seconds. Not far away, J.C.'s stepfather, Carl Probin, witnessed the attack from the front yard. He immediately jumped on his mountain bike and chased after the car. Despite pedaling as fast as he could, the vehicle quickly disappeared. Carl was unable to read the license plate clearly, but he knew there were 2 people inside, including a woman. He called the police immediately. Authorities responded with one of the largest search operations in El Dorado County's history. Local police, the FBI, helicopters, police dogs, and hundreds of volunteers joined the effort. Within hours, media outlets across the region were broadcasting J.C.'s disappearance and urging the public to help. Investigators created composite sketches based on descriptions from witnesses and J.C.'s classmates, but the sightings were too brief to guarantee accuracy. Despite hundreds of reported tips, no meaningful leads emerged. As the days passed, J.C.'s disappearance drew national attention. Tens of thousands of missing person posters were distributed across the country. Because pink was J.C.'s favorite color, pink ribbons appeared throughout her hometown as a symbol of hope and support for her family. Refusing to give up, J.C.'s mother established an organization called J.C.'s Hope to keep the search alive, support volunteers, provide counseling, and raise funds. Missing person flyers, posters, t-shirts, and other materials featuring J.C.'s image soon spread widely across the United States. Yet, despite the enormous search effort and nationwide attention, J.C. seemed to have vanished without a trace. Unknown to investigators, the man responsible for her disappearance was living only a few hundred kilometers away, while the search for the missing girl continued year after year. As weeks turned into months, the massive search for J.C. began to lose momentum. Hundreds of reported sightings had been investigated. Countless tips had been followed. Search teams had combed forests, roads, and remote areas throughout Northern California. Yet J.C. was nowhere to be found. With no evidence pointing toward an outside suspect, investigators gradually turned their attention to the people closest to her, and the first person they focused on was Carl Probin. J.C.'s stepfather had witnessed the abduction with his own eyes. He was the last known person to see her before she disappeared. For detectives desperate for answers, That fact alone made him impossible to ignore. At first, Carl cooperated fully. He gave statement after statement, answering the same questions repeatedly. He described the gray car. He described the man. He described the woman sitting inside the vehicle. He recounted every second of the chase on his bicycle. But as days turned into weeks, the interviews did not stop. Investigators subjected him to multiple polygraph examinations. He passed every one of them. Still, suspicion remained. To many people, Carl fit a familiar narrative. Rumors began spreading throughout the community. Some people argued that stepfathers were often responsible in child disappearance cases. Others convinced themselves that Carl must be hiding something. Before long, whispers became accusations. The media amplified the speculation. Friends grew distant. Strangers looked at him differently. The man who had desperately chased a kidnapper's car down the road suddenly found himself treated as a possible murderer. And the nightmare did not end after a few months. For nearly 18 years, Carl lived under that cloud of suspicion. Investigators also examined another possibility. The second person investigators considered was JC's biological father, Ken Slayton. Some detectives theorized that he might have wanted custody of his daughter and had resorted to extreme measures to take her. However, further investigation revealed a surprising fact. Ken did not even know that JC existed. Years earlier, Ken and JC's mother had been in a relationship, but they separated before JC was born. Terry never informed him that she was pregnant. Once investigators confirmed this, Ken was removed from the list of suspects. With no viable suspects and no meaningful leads, the case gradually went cold. As the years passed, public attention faded. Many people began to believe that JC had been abandoned somewhere remote and was no longer alive. Despite the growing pessimism, JC's mother never gave up hope. She remained convinced that her daughter was still alive. More than 1 million missing person flyers featuring JC were distributed over the years. As technology improved, investigators and volunteers created age-progressed images showing what JC might look like as she grew older. Returning to the 10th of June 1991, JC was taken to 1554 Walnut Avenue in Antioch, a suburban home in the East Bay that, from the front, looked like any other house in the neighborhood. She was held in a dilapidated shed, surrounded by a cluster of worn-out tents covered with plastic tarps. Inside were piles of old belongings, junk, and trash. At first glance, the area looked like nothing more than an abandoned backyard, attracting little attention from anyone nearby. The people who brought her there were a deeply disturbed married couple. The husband was Philip Garrido, and the wife was Nancy Garrido. Philip Garrido had a long criminal history. In 1976, at the age of 25, he kidnapped and repeatedly raped a young woman named Catherine Calloway Hall. The crime was discovered by a patrol officer, leading to Garrido's arrest and a 50-year prison sentence. Despite his violent past, Garrido was released on parole in 1988 after serving only 11 years. Authorities placed him under supervision and fitted him with an electronic ankle monitor, unaware that he would later commit another horrific crime. Over time, Garrido did far more than keep JC physically trapped. He worked to control the way she thought and viewed the world. He constantly told her that he had been chosen by God and that everything happening around her was part of a larger plan. He controlled what she was allowed to know, who she could talk to, and what she was allowed to believe. For years, JC lived in a place where time seemed to stop. The world moved forward without her. Classmates graduated. Families celebrated birthdays and holidays. Children grew up. Meanwhile, she remained hidden behind fences and tarps, watching her own childhood disappear one day at a time. Some nights, she cried herself to sleep, wondering whether her mother was still looking for her. Other nights, she was afraid to think about home at all. Because the longer she remembered, the more painful the loss became. And slowly, the hope of being rescued gave way to something even more heartbreaking: the need to survive another day. JC was repeatedly raped by Garrido, beginning from the time of her abduction at age 11. This continued throughout her captivity. During the years when Garrido's drug use intensified, he used cocaine and methamphetamine. The abuse was at its most severe. In 1994, at 14 years old, JC gave birth to her first daughter. There was no doctor, no hospital, no anesthesia, no medical support of any kind for a 14-year-old girl or her newborn. Nancy Garrido was present. That was all. In 1997, at 17, JC gave birth to a second daughter under nearly identical conditions. Garrido told anyone who asked that the girls were his granddaughters. JC was given a new name, Alyssa. The children were taught to call Nancy their mother and to refer to JC as their sister. JC accepted the arrangement. The alternative, she understood, was losing them. The birth of her first daughter changed JC's interior life profoundly. She later wrote about this in her memoir, about how the presence of a child who needed her gave her something to hold on to, a reason not to take risks, a reason to survive. Her daughters became, simultaneously, her greatest vulnerability and her greatest strength. Garrido gave JC limited freedoms as the years passed, and his confidence in her compliance grew. She occasionally left the compound with Nancy to go to the beach, to get her nails done, small windows into a world she'd been cut off from for a decade or more. She never ran. Not because she couldn't, but because she had daughters inside that compound, and she would not leave without them. Between 1999 and 2009, Philip Garrido's parole officers conducted 60 home checks at 1554 Walnut Avenue. 60 visits, 10 years, and not once, not a single time did any parole officer enter the backyard. Each visit followed the same pattern. Arrive at the front of the property, speak with Garrido at the door, document in the file that the parolee was complying with conditions, leave. This is not a minor procedural gap. A full property inspection is a baseline requirement when supervising a convicted sex offender, particularly one whose documented criminal history included kidnapping, holding victims in enclosed spaces, and sexual assault. Garrido's file alone contained everything a thorough supervisor would need to understand that a conversation at the front door was not sufficient. JC and her daughters were in the backyard, every time, separated from those parole officers by a fence and a set of tarps. In 2006, a neighbor took a step that should have changed everything. She called the Antioch Police Department and reported that people were living in tents behind the Garrido house, that she could hear children's voices coming from behind the covered enclosure. This was first-hand, proximate information from someone with direct sensory access to what was happening. Antioch police responded. They went to 1554 Walnut Avenue. They spoke with Garrido at the front of the house. They did not enter the backyard. They filed a report concluding there were no issues at the address, and they left. In 2008, Garrido's own parole agency initiated an internal investigation after receiving information about his unusual behavior. Investigators visited the property, questioned Garrido, and again, no one checked the backyard. 3 separate moments where the truth was within reach. 3 times the door was approached and not opened. JC later sued the state of California over these failures. California settled for $20 million, the largest settlement in state history for parole supervision failures. The settlement was not compensation, it was an acknowledgement. What happened to JC Dugard over 18 years was not only the crime of Philip and Nancy Garrido, it was also the product of a system that repeatedly chose to look away. On the 24th of August, 2009, Philip Garrido arrived at the UC Berkeley campus with 2 teenage girls, his biological daughters with JC. He wanted permission to hold a religious event for his group, which he called God's Desire. JC was not with him. She was still in Antioch. The first person he encountered was Lisa Campbell, manager of the UCPD events office. Campbell's job was to process permit requests. What she did instead was notice. Garrido's manner was erratic. He spoke about his religious mission with the intensity of someone disconnected from a shared reality. The 2 girls with him were pale, withdrawn, and visibly uncomfortable. They made little eye contact. They deferred completely. Campbell did not have evidence. She had something more primary than that, a settled, specific sense that something was wrong. She told Garrido she'd need to schedule a follow-up meeting for the next afternoon, buying time, and immediately contacted Officer Allison Jacobs of the UC Berkeley Police Department. Jacobs ran a background check. The results were immediate and stark. Philip Garrido was a registered sex offender on active federal parole for kidnapping and rape since 1976, and his parole file contained no record of children. He had arrived at a university campus with 2 teenage girls he called his daughters, girls who didn't appear in any official record connected to him. On August 25th, Jacobs and Campbell met Garrido for the second time. They kept the conversation casual. They gave no indication they were building a case. Their goal was to keep him present long enough for parole to act. At one point, Garrido opened his bag and produced a self-published book about schizophrenia. After the meeting, Officer Jacobs contacted Parole Officer Edward Santos Jr. directly, not through bureaucratic channels, not with a memo. She called him and told him what she had seen and what she had found. Santos recognized that this was new information that had no place in Garrido's file, and he summoned Garrido to the Concord Parole Office immediately, instructing him to bring everyone. On the 26th of August 2009, Philip Garrido arrived at the Concord Parole Office with Nancy Garrido, the two teenage girls, and a young woman he introduced as his niece, a woman he called Alyssa. Investigators separated everyone for individual questioning. Under sustained interrogation, Garrido broke. He confessed that he had kidnapped and raped J.C. Lee Dugard in 1991. In a separate room, the young woman, identified as Alyssa, was asked who she really was. She took a piece of paper. She wrote down her name, J.C. Lee Dugard. The 11-year-old girl who had stood at a bus stop in Myers, California on a June morning in 1991, whose stepfather had chased the kidnapper's car on a bicycle until the road ran out, was now 29 years old. She was sitting in a parole office in Concord, California, saying her name out loud for the first time in 18 years. That night, the FBI arranged a phone call. On one end, J.C. Lee Dugard, in a safe location somewhere in Northern California. On the other, Terry Probin, her mother, the woman who had never stopped believing her daughter was alive, who was in Southern California when the call came in. It was the first time they had heard each other's voices in 18 years, 2 months, and 16 days. The next morning, the 27th of August, 2009, Terry flew north. She walked into a room and saw her daughter and two granddaughters she had never known existed. JC's aunt, Tina Dugard, was present at the reunion. She later described what she saw. Her sister's smile, she said, was as wide as the ocean. Her daughter was finally home, and here is a detail that is almost impossible to sit with. Throughout all 18 years of JC's captivity, she had been held in Antioch, California, roughly 190 miles from her home in South Lake Tahoe. Less than a 2-hour drive. Terry Probin had spent 18 years searching, praying, refusing to give up hope, and her daughter had been within a 2-hour drive the entire time. On the day JC was found, Carl Probin was still on a list of persons of interest. He had been there since the 10th of June, 1991. 18 years of questioning. Polygraph tests he kept passing. A community that quietly and sometimes not so quietly believed the worst about him. A marriage that had dissolved under the weight of it. A reputation that could never fully recover, no matter how many tests he passed, no matter how clearly he described what he had seen. He had been the only one who tried to stop it. He had seen the gray sedan. He had seen the man with the stun gun. He had chased the car on his bicycle until it was gone, and then he had called 911. And for all of that, he had spent 18 years as the man most suspected of killing his stepdaughter. When JC was found, everything he had said was confirmed. Everything he had described was true. He was exonerated not by a court or a formal process, but simply by the fact of her survival. She came back, and the case against him evaporated because there had never been a real case, only assumption and pressure, and 18 years of a community's darkest instinct directed at the wrong man. Carl Probin's story is not a footnote to JC's. It is a second story running alongside hers of what happens when a justice system, under pressure to find answers, applies that pressure to the most convenient target instead of the right one. Philip and Nancy Garrido were arrested on the 26th of August 2009 at the Concord Parole Office. The charges were extensive: kidnapping, false imprisonment, multiple counts of rape, lewd acts with a minor under 14, and numerous related offenses spanning 18 years. In April 2011, nearly 2 years after their arrest, both entered guilty pleas, a resolution specifically designed to spare JC and her daughters from testifying in open court. Philip Garrido pleaded guilty to 1 count of kidnapping and 13 counts of sexual assault, including 6 counts of rape and 7 counts of lewd acts with a minor. Nancy Garrido pleaded guilty to 1 count of kidnapping and 1 count of forcible rape. At sentencing in June 2011 at El Dorado County Superior Court in Placerville, California, JC was not present. She sent a written statement instead. A portion of it was read aloud in the courtroom by her mother, Terry Probyn. "I choose not to be here today because I refuse to waste one more second of my life in your presence. Everything you did to me was wrong. I hated every single second of every single day for 18 years. You stole my life and the life of my family." Judge Douglas C. Pfister sentenced Philip Garrido to 431 years to life in California State Prison. Nancy Garrido received 36 years to life, the maximum sentence available under the laws in effect at the time of the crimes. Philip Garrido was 60 years old at sentencing. He will die in prison. In the years following her dramatic rescue, JC Lee Dugard did not disappear into the shadows. Instead, she chose to step forward and transform her painful past into a source of strength and hope for others. In 2011, she published her memoir, A Stolen Life, which quickly became a bestseller. The book was widely praised as one of the most honest and powerful survivor accounts ever written. Its strength did not come from graphic descriptions of horror, but from its deep psychological truth. JC openly shared the reality of surviving long-term captivity, the difficult task of protecting her children in an environment where no good choices existed, and the struggle to remain human when someone was actively trying to reduce her to something less than human. She also founded the JYC Foundation, a name taken from her own initials, JCA Dugard. The organization is dedicated to supporting both families and victims of abduction. It places special emphasis on the complex process of reintegration and long-term recovery areas where traditional medical and legal systems often fall short and cannot fully address the deep trauma involved. Through her work, JC turned the 18 years that were stolen from her into something that now belongs to others. She created a valuable resource, a powerful voice, and a living example that says with authenticity, "You can survive this." Only someone who endured what she did could deliver that message with such credibility. Her former therapist publicly described JC as living remarkably well. She is someone who feels proud of what she has built in the years since leaving the backyard compound in Antioch. JC's journey after rescue stands as a testament to resilience, purpose, and the power of turning personal tragedy into meaningful impact. This case leaves three things that matter. Listen to victims. Before JC was taken, Catherine Calloway Hall, the woman Garrido had previously kidnapped and raped, contacted his parole agent directly to warn that he was still dangerous. The agent dismissed her as hysterical. 3 years later, JC was abducted. The person who survived his violence understood his risk better than anyone. The system chose not to hear her. Supervision must mean something. 60 home visits in 10 years. Every time. Front door, brief conversation, file closed. Not once did anyone check the backyard where JC and her daughters were living behind fences and tarps, meters away. California's $20 million settlement wasn't compensation. It was a confession that the system had failed. A front door conversation is not supervision. It is theater. Trust what feels wrong. 2 UC Berkeley staff members, Lisa Campbell and Officer Allison Jacobs, had no warrant, no tip, no evidence. They had a feeling. Garrido's behavior was erratic. The girls with him were pale and withdrawn. Campbell bought time. Jacobs ran the background check. That instinct, acted on, ended 18 years of captivity. Dozens of trained officers had visited the same address and seen nothing. These two succeeded not because they had better tools, but because they refused to look away. On the morning of the 10th of June, 1991, an 11-year-old girl walked to her bus stop wearing a silver butterfly ring, thinking about a water park trip. 30 seconds later, she was gone. She came back. And the man who chased the car on his bicycle, who spent 18 years suspected of a crime he witnessed, was finally free of it too. If you ever see a child who looks afraid, overly controlled, or simply wrong, you don't need proof. You only need to say something. That's what finally brought her home.